I'm Shawn and today we're going to be discussing the burden of self and the power of worldview. Culture basically is how we do things in the world. Every culture will contain rites, rituals, traditions, customs, and behaviors. They are enforced by rewards and sanctions. Every culture has a worldview, and worldview leads to behavior, and behaviors are a core indicator to our core beliefs. So let's start from the very beginning with rights. A right is a benefit that one receives by being a part of the in-group. That's R-I-T-E-S. Rituals are the things in which we do over and over. It might be something as simple as every Saturday having pancakes with your family. It could be once a month doing communion or every Sunday doing communion. Traditions are things that are different among people that we tend to do. You might have a tradition of opening up gifts during Christmas Eve. You might have the tradition of opening up gifts on Christmas Day. Customs are the things in which we do that also vary. It might be customary to remove your shoes when you're in your home, or it might be customary to leave your shoes on. And behaviors are quite simply the things that encapsulate all those things. These things lead to what's called implicit social cognition. Another word for that is implicit bias. This refers to the enculturated beliefs, attitudes, and even stereotypes that affect our worldview, which impacts our actions and decisions in an unconscious manner. So with this enculturation, it's important to remember that as it relates to the brain, everything forward is backwards. So let me ask you a question. For half a second, I want you to imagine, what does alligator taste like? Did you say chicken? Because if you did, the majority of the people who ever had alligator say it tastes just like chicken, and they would be wrong, because alligator tastes just like alligator. So what does that mean? It means every time we experience something new, our brain automatically goes back to the thing it used to be. So this smells like a brand new car. This feels like leather. This tastes like something else. And so our brains are constantly navigating reality by going backwards. Basically, your whole experience is based upon past experiences. With that being said, let's take a look at diversity in culture. Every worldview contains a cluster of foundational beliefs, which we call paradigms. Now, a paradigm is quite simply a habitual way of thinking about something. It's kind of always on repeat, right? So it plays itself out, you hit rewind, and then play again. Now, culture is structured by our worldview. And remember, worldview always produces cultural norms, and cultural norms always enforce or reinforce paradigms. So there's always this dance between our culture and our worldview, constantly in this dance. Now, implicit bias training, or the work which we do, is both and, meaning implicit bias training is a cultural and paradigm shift. But how does that work? Here's how this works. I want you to imagine that you have a personal dresser drawer in your home. Now, I want you to imagine or think about what's in the top shelf. Can you do that? Are you close to remembering 90% sure what's in the top? 100% sure? This is the way in which you understand your reality. Now, as you look at other rooms in the house, are there other dresser drawers? Do you have enough understanding to 100% to know, I am certain this is what's in top of these drawers? The question becomes, what about your neighbors? What about those in another city? Basically, the thought is the further you move away from your own personal thought, your own personal dresser drawer, not the more you know, but the less you know. So it's important to understand that as it relates to your worldview is yours, but that's different from how the world may see things. It's important to also understand that implicit biases are pervasive. It's like a virus. and it just tends to spread. And so you might have a particular view on something and not completely be aware of it, and it just spread through other types of thinking. So for myself, I really don't like onions. I don't like them whatsoever. And so they tend to taint everything that I see them in, whether it's a burger or a salad or in lasagna or spaghetti. In my mind, I somehow reduce the item because it contains something that I'm not particularly fond of. It's important to also realize that everyone possesses implicit biases. They're not good, they're not bad, they're enculturations based upon our worldview. It's also to understand that we don't necessarily have to have our implicit biases make sense. We can literally say, I believe in this, and then literally under pressure, our bodies then respond a certain way. I might say something to the degree of, I believe that all people deserve whatever, ... Now, placed under pressure, my behavior and my actions might be just the opposite of that thing. Our implicit biases are easily influenced. There doesn't take a great deal of data to convince us of what we already believe. So I already believe this. It's already in my mind. I'm already moving on this path. Anything that you say to me that helps me along this isn't going to be a negative for me. Normally, we can gradually begin to unlearn our implicit biases through debiasing techniques. Here are a few of the techniques. Now, there are these what's called neurological tests and exercises. One of them is called the IDI, which basically just stands for the Intercultural Development Index, which measures one's culture competency. There's the ICS, which is the Intercultural Conflict Survey, that measures how one deals with culture and conflict. And Harvard has what's called an implicit bias web page, and it's just designed just for implicit biases. Other things that we can do is ask ourselves major questions. One of them is, why do I believe this? What makes me believe this particular thing, and how did I get this in my head? What do I gain from having this belief? One of the things in which we have to understand that most of our enculturated beliefs help us gain more power and more authority. And when I say power, it simply means the means to do something, while authority is the right to do something. Did I ever get hurt? Was there something that triggered this thought, like I don't like dogs because of nothing, or I don't like dogs because I had a bad experience with them? And then what are my past experiences with my world and the things in which I enjoy and don't enjoy, or I do enjoy? It's important to understand that the majority of our biases are inside of us to protect us from something that we thought was not appropriate or wrong or harmful to us. Another way in which we can deal with implicit bias is forming healthy relationships. This is not the same as what some would call contact versus challenge. So when I say contact, that doesn't mean during Cinco de Mayo going and celebrating and going to a parade and engaging in the food and the fabric and the festival. That would be contact. What I'm referring to is what would be considered a challenging relationship, where I am meeting with someone who is challenging my implicit biases, asking me questions as we build a healthy relationship. Another thing which is also important, which is going back to what I call the 3 F's: food, fabric, and festival. When I talk about food, that's quite simply trying other people's food that you don't normally try. So that might be, if you are someone who's normally a meat and potatoes person, maybe you'll try fish and vegetables from another person's culture. When I say fabric, I am talking about different ways in which you can dress, different clothing. Let's just say that you have some friends who have bought you a particular scarf from a certain region of the world. Feeling comfortable in other people's clothing is also important. And again, there's always the festivals in which engaging in things like Kwanzaa or Hmong New Year or Cinco de Mayo or anything that would be different from your own cultural understanding or background. And again, it's important that we avoid tokenism. That is, using other people for their benefits. We really do want to be involved in healthy relationships and not seeing people as an ends to helping us walk through our own biases. Again, I think it's highly important to be aware of confirmation bias, which just means it takes very little data to convince me of what I already believe. And when we start to do this, it doesn't help us with our implicit biases, but keeps them in place. As we continue on with the debiasing techniques, it's important to have other people speak into our lives. So asking other people, hey, what did you see? What did you hear me say? Discuss your thoughts with other individuals, right? This 360 review of having other people speak into your lives. Don't rush to judgment, which is something that we do quite a bit, but I would challenge us all not to jump to judgment using what I would call a 360 review by asking friends and family, how do I actually sound and behave as it relates to certain topics? And lastly, trying to incorporate as many voices as you possibly can into your reality. So then the question becomes, so what? What does this all mean, the implicit biases, and why would I want to work on them? Well, number one, perception. Here's the deal. You only know what you've been able to see. So you only know what you've perceived. And so you've only gone to one middle school or two or three or a few high schools or one college. You've gained a great deal of knowledge, but that knowledge is only contained in a very small cluster or field. So it's important to try to have as many unique voices speak into your life. Remember, human perception is 100% your own. What do you see versus what there really is. So once again, the question becomes, why do we want to do implicit bias training? And how does this connect to cross-cultural ministry, racial reconciliation, gender studies, and even being able to have healthy conversations with LGBTQ folks? Well, here's the deal. Number one, you always connect to other people through your worldview. That's how you connect to people. Two, your stories that you've collected are based upon your past and only your past. And three, your past enculturations really do inform your biases. Again, let's review worldview. What is a worldview? First of all, a worldview is a foundational understanding of how you see the world. And each worldview has 5 main clusters in them. Number one, there's deity. How do you understand God or gods or no God? There's ethics. This is should I or should I not, or ought I or ought I not. There's anthropology, which answers what does it mean to be human? Metaphysics, what is real? And epistemology, how do I know what I know? And there are 3 ways in which we know what we know, and 2 of them we can address by scientific endeavors. And the third one, which I'll talk about here in a second, is more of something on faith of what we believe. The first one is we know what we know by authority figures. Our mom, our dad, lawyers, doctors, our senior pastor, our youth pastor, people who we literally give authority to kind of tell us how the world is, and we kind of take that for what it is. That's one way. The second way in which we understand things is how we experience things, right? We know what something sweet tastes like because we've had some sweets. We know if the stove is hot because we burnt our hands. So those are the 2 ways in which we understand our reality. 1, authority figures. 2, personal experiences. Now, the third one has been called kismet, third eye, and it's for Christians, we kind of call this divine intervention. This is where I didn't experience it and I didn't know it, yet something miraculous takes over and I'm able to navigate or understand that thing. It's important to understand that we always communicate through our worldview. So whatever our worldview is, that is the way we communicate about that. Our worldview will always help us deal with our cultural norms and also conflict. So we navigate our world with a cultural understanding, but also we have what's called a cultural conflict communication style. And how does that work? It works like this. So the source of all cultural conflict is our worldview. And once again, worldview is quite simply two things. It is A, our culture, B, communication style. And those two things represent three main ideologies, which are how do we see the world, how do we do things in the world, and how we communicate about the world. So as we think about implicit bias, worldview, our communication style, I'm going to end part one with the symptoms of cultural conflict. The reason why we have cultural conflict is because our worldview, right, reinforces our implicit biases, and those will always come into play in these 6 ways. Number one, we have conflict over data. They would disagree about what the data says, that they don't mean hard science. You'll find people who will then have these debates over what does the data actually mean. We have cultural conflict over relationships. What does it mean to be in a loving relationship might be different from person to person or group to group or even from nation to nation. We have value conflicts in which I might hold something as a particular value that you may not. We have systems cultural conflicts in which, let's say that a cultural group has a particular system in which it navigates its reality, which is different from my own. The big one is always going to be resources. As humans, we partake in an array of resources, and there might be a different cultural understanding of how to deal with resources. And lastly, which is the one in which we almost always hear about, are historical cultural conflict. It is here that we hear the most about conflict, and we hear so because through conflict we have wars between nations. We have done kind of atrocious things to each other within our own countries, and there's always this kind of historical, personal conflict based upon worldview.